everybody. Welcome to Slam, the podcast that reviews every single DC superhero ever, focusing on their origin. And I am your co-host, Mike L., and I'm not joined by Joshua Mervell because unfortunately he is under the weather today, but I am joined by special returning guest host, Adam Pelche. Thank you for joining us, Adam.
You're welcome, Mike, and hello, everyone out there. I'm very excited to talk about this very obscure hero that I don't think a lot of people have heard about.
No, but we're going to educate them today, aren't we?
Yeah, it's Bateman.
That's right, Bateman. Yes.
Bateman.
Untold Legend of Bateman. You got it. Yes. No, actually, we're talking about the world's most popular superhero. I wish it was Superman, but it's actually Batman.
Mm-hmm.
I love Batman. We've talked about Batman on the show many, many times. Some people hate Batman. I love Batman. Now, I'll just say this. One thing I thought about as I was reading these origins is, can you imagine being a Batman fan in 1980 and loving Batman and knowing 40-ish years of history and knowing it all and understanding it all and memorizing it all, but also knowing that there was another 40 years to come that would be even bigger, where the character would become even more successful? It's just kind of interesting to put yourself in that mindset. I don't know, did you think about that at all when you're reading these origins? No.
Well, definitely something that came to mind for me was the purpose of these origins, because I think Batman belongs to the certain niche of superheroes. You brought up Superman, but I'd also bring up Spider-Man as characters who've had their origin stories retold time and time again ad nauseum, to the point where I think most readers or the general public would just throw up their hands and say, no more, we get it. We know how he became Spider-Man or Batman.
Right.
But, you know, putting my mind into what it was like for a comic reader at this time, we didn't have the same level of the trades publication that we do now. The internet certainly wasn't a thing, and the adaptations that were out there, I mean, I think the last two big adaptations of Batman by this point were the Super Friends cartoon and the Adam West series. So those pretty much steered away from the darker origins of the character, which actually to me makes a lot of sense, because I could imagine a child or maybe a young teen going into a newsstand, picking this up and going, oh, the origin of Batman. I love Batman, but I don't actually know why he became Batman. Unheard of in this day and age. No one would say that, but at that point, what an eye-opening revelation this series of comics must have made for that individual.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I guess another analogy I could think of is, for example, pre-July 2023, everyone on Earth knew who Barbie was. But now Barbie is the star of the #1 movie of 2023, the biggest movie ever directed by a woman. And potentially, but depending on what they do with this franchise, 10 or 20 years from now, Barbie could be as big as Batman. Like, that sounds crazy, but it's possible. Because at one point, Batman was just a comics character that had been adapted into a hit TV show. And he was on the verge of cancellation a lot. Like, he was on the verge of cancellation in the 50s. He was on the verge of cancellation in the 70s. They were actually going to cancel Detective Comics in the late 70s.
Oh,
it was
wow.
it was on the chopping block. So at this point, I'm assuming his popularity had resurged a little bit. Oh, and we should probably mention the main focus of today's episode is the Untold Legend of Batman. But before we get to that, we're going to review two other short recaps, because I actually, to be honest, thought that Batman's origin was told more often, because as we see in other episodes of Slam, Superman's origin is retold like every 5 years, it seems. But it's partly because they're constantly altering when his career starts. First, it's when he's in, like a young adult. Then it's when he's a teenager. Then it's when he's a baby. That's one reason. It's also because they're adding so much to his lore that they keep revising, right? Like new characters and adding them in and blah, blah, blah. That didn't happen as much as with Batman.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about, we're going to review Detective Comics 190 and Detective Comics 560. The first one takes place before Untold Legend of Batman, and the second one takes place after. But actually, Adam, would you like to do the honors of summarizing this first two-pager from Detective Comics 190?
Okay, so we have Batman and Robin within the Wayne Manor mansion, of course. And you have Robin going, his usual spree of no one but I knows that you're secretly the Batman. And of
Hmm.
course, Batman then must pontificate about his origins, in which case it's pretty much the standard that we know. His parents are stuck up by a robber, they are shot. The mother's pearls that are strung around her neck snap and scatter around the ground. Then we have a young Bruce Wayne crying over their bodies as the robber makes his way away under the lamplight. He broods over their graves and swears he'll bring justice to their memory and to the world. And then we have really just a panel or two of him just being depicted as exploring really his traits that will make him develop into Batman, his detective skills, his science skills.
Hmm.
Then we have a single panel, one of the most infamous scenes in all the origin of Batman, where a bat flies through the window and Bruce Wayne is looking up and he goes, "A bat, that's it. I'll become like a bat." And then that's what prompts him to become Batman. He then quickly recaps what happened with Dick Grayson, with his own parents meeting their demise, how he brought him up as his ward, and how he trained him to become Robin, ending off with a little vignette of them training together. And that's essentially it. It's a two-page
Right.
recap of the origin of Batman and Robin, and that's pretty much all there is to it.
So, without going back and revisiting all the previous origins of Batman, I just like to point out a couple details that in this version, Joe Chill only fires one bullet. The bullet kills Thomas Wayne. Martha Wayne dies from a heart attack. In later versions, possibly starting with Frank Miller's, he shoots both of them, which I think is cleaner. I mean, if you're gonna write a story, I think it's cleaner to have him shoot both, not have one but die from a bullet and the other die from a heart attack. That's just my opinion. They also they dropped the famous line. Oh, actually, he says it in the narration. When you were ready, oh, this is Robin talking. When you were ready to take up your role in life, you chose a disguise that would strike terror into superstitious criminals. You got to have that line. Criminals are a superstitious, cowardly lot. Like, that's a classic line. And Frank Miller figured out a way to incorporate it into Bruce Wayne was reading a book, and that line was in the book. But either way, that's a great line. What do you think of that famous line?
Oh no, it's iconic. It's there for a reason. It's up there with
Right.
power and responsibility. It
Yep.
has to be said at some point during a Batman origin. With that said, with the brevity of this, this is pretty much all you need to know. This is like the bare bones of every adaptation of Batman's origin and his relationship with Robin, pretty much ongoing from here on out. And as we're going to see, there's been elaborations, there's been kind of Mobius strips of lore woven in, but nothing as clean cut and direct as this.
Yes. And I should point out this story was actually written by Bill Finger, who wrote the first Batman story, who created his origin, who created everything except the name. And then it was penciled supposedly by Bob Kane, but ghost drawn by Sayre Schwartz. So I'm going to assume that guy did most of the work. What did you think of the artwork in this two-pager that we're reading here?
I thought the artwork was pretty good for the most part, like definitely betraying elements of the era was drafted in, but it's dynamic. We have a lot of expression. As always with 50s comics, you have a lot of great use of color popping in here. I mean, for being a product of its time, it's a very good example of a product of its time. Some of the character models are a bit stiff, but I don't know. Overall, I was impressed. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, I enjoyed it too. I mean, I feel like we've talked about this before, but when I read a 50s Batman, I feel like everything fits. The writing and the art and the characterization and the color all fit together as one cohesive whole. But now we're going to jump past Untold Legend of Batman, and we're going to talk about Detective Comics 560. And again, we're not reading the whole issue. We're not talking about the whole issue. We're just talking about these two pages where what ends up happening is Bruce Wayne, for some reason, is flashing back. Oops, just a minute here. Just let me get my thing going here. He's flashing back, and he's remembering how he became Batman. And we see a two panel sequence where basically he's sitting on like a ledge in the Batcave, and he flashes back, and we see the narration. That chill night, his parents were murdered when he was still so young. The funeral when he felt even younger and so very lost. All the signposts to his future brutally cut down. Now, I want to point out, based on my limited research and according to DCFandom.com, this was only the second time since the 1950s that we would have seen this origin. Now that I say that, I believe Neil Adams might have drawn a version of the origin, but I don't think it was in a regular issue. It might have been in like a weird treasury size edition or something. So at this time, there might have been entire generations of kids that grew up without ever reading his origin, right? So it's just kind of an interesting thing. Then we see a sequence of Bruce Wayne reading, training, doing some aerobics. Now we see the famous scene of him sitting in his study, and he's trying to figure out, what he can do to fight crime and, blah, blah, blah. And then just at that moment, we see the bat fly through the window. And it's funny because this artwork by Gene Colan, a classic DC and Marvel artist, famous for doing things like Tomb of Dracula and stuff like that. We see this beautiful shot of a Batman flying in, and then Bruce Wayne all in shadow. And then the next shot, he's in the Adam West Batman suit, the classic 60s one. Garish colors, big yellow circle around the bat. So it is a little bit comical, but it is a nice little effect. And I think there's a slightly conscious choice to make that flashback Batman look a little bit more jovial and kind of its time than the current Batman, which when we cut to the present day, Batman's standing on like a ledge and his cape is a little bit longer and he's a little bit more in shadow. So but that's pretty much it. And then we go on with the rest of the story, which we're not going to talk about. But basically, that's our two-pager right there. And there's not really much to it. But what did you think of this one, Adam?
Definitely, I think we can see how the direction of what the Batman fan had changed in these times. Like, definitely we're seeing a darker, more brooding interest in the Dark Knight and the focus on that as the appellation for him, the Dark Knight. Batman is no longer this colorful, bright character, even though Marred in Tragedy still has a sort of hope and the spontaneity about his character. Here it is all very muddy, heavy inks, which really just, I think, breathe that atmosphere. I think it's just as effective as the other two-page spread, which we saw. I think it really covers essentially the exact same points. I think it's just, how is it depicted? It's definitely a lot moodier. It's a lot darker. I actually do have to say, while I'm not always a fan of making Batman such a dark, brooding character, the use of inks was very effective here, and I think it really portrayed that. I think also there's a single panel. It's actually, I believe, the fourth last panel for this two-page spread where it's just the shadow of Batman. And I think that really encapsulates the difference that we're seeing in who Batman is as he's being depicted in this era. He's no longer the bright, happy, well, I shouldn't say happy, but the bright, child-friendly character. He is a shadow. He is a legend. He is kind of a phantom. And that, I think, is paired with the image of the spider in the web. I'm sure that pertains to the plot of the book itself as the comic goes on, but what a great image to really capture the difference between that Batman that we were reading about and this one, particularly the absence of Robin.
Good point. Yep. And we should point out that at this stage in Batman's career, this is 1983. No, this is 86. Wow. So this is only months before his origin was rebooted by Frank Miller. Interesting. But at this point, he did have Robin as his partner, but it was Robin 2, which was Jason Todd. But Jason Todd had his pre-crisis origin. He didn't have his post-crisis origin. So Jason Todd's pre-crisis origin duplicated Dick Grayson's. It was exactly the same. His parents, he was in a circus. His parents were killed by a crime boss, blah, 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 blah. The only thing I can say about 80s Batman, if you want to say starting around 1980, I believe Len Wein might have been the writer around then, and then it led into Jerry Conway and then Doug Moench. I think it's an interesting time because for a while in the 70s and on, Batman was not in the Wayne Manor. He didn't have his original Batcave. He moved to Gotham City. He was in Wayne Tower, I think it was called, and he had a new Batcave, which was underneath Wayne Tower. And that
Yes, that's even
weird,
touched upon in the Untold Legend of Batman,
yes,
we'll be talking about in a moment.
right. And it's weird because that was actually used by Christopher Nolan in The Dark Knight. It's something, a detail I don't really think about, but he was in Wayne Tower, and his Batcave was a big white room. You remember that in Dark Knight?
Hmm.
Just a weird time. I mean, there's nothing wrong with change, but I'm surprised that change lasted as long as it did, something like 5 to 10 years. It's just a little bit surprising. But we should point out that that little origin was written by Doug Moench, drawn by, like we said, Gene Colan. I'm going to say 80s, early 80s Batman. Sometimes the writing's not great, but the mood, especially when it's Gene Colan, it's right there. Like that's 80s Batman to me. Gene Colan. Another great artist from this time was Don Newton. He's another great Batman artist. So it's definitely a strange period for Batman's characterization before Frank Miller came along, but I still enjoy it. So if you're a fan of that type of style, then check it out. But now we're going to jump to the main event of today's episode, which is something I kind of wish we would have got from other DC characters at the time. But what happened was Len Wein was given the assignment of summarizing some of the contradictory elements of Batman's origin into one cohesive story called The Untold Legend of Batman. It was a miniseries, a 3-issue miniseries. And apparently what happened was John Byrne at the time was working for Marvel, and I'm not sure if this was around when he was on X-Men, but he apparently had a gap in his schedule, a 3-month gap. And so he contacted DC and he said, "Hey, I got some free time. Do you got anything for me?" And they're like, "Okay, sure. How about this super important miniseries where we, retell Batman's origin?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." So he apparently drew the first issue, and something happened where the plot for issues 2 and 3 was really, really late coming in. And so then he was like, "Well, I can't do it now. The gap in my schedule is now done, and now I have to go back to my regular assignment." So he couldn't finish 2 and 3. Now, to be fair, to be the devil's advocate for DC, John Byrne is also infamous for dropping out of the Hulk, Fantastic Four, West Coast Avengers, all mid-storyline. So it's not like this is an unusual thing for him. So there might be another side to the story, but this is all we know. So the remaining 2 issues were drawn by Jim Aparo, who was the most prolific Batman artist of the 70s and 80s anyway. So I personally prefer the Jim Aparo issues, which we'll talk about later. But how about this? I'll summarize number 1, and you can do 2, and then we'll team up on 3. How's that?
That sounds good to me. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so starting with Untold Legend of Batman number 1, we've got this really cool cover of a cover within a cover where we see like a book, and it's called The Untold Legend of the Batman, and we see Riddler, Penguin, and Joker looking at the book, and Joker's like, "This book will tell us everything we need to know to defeat Batman." It's kind of a scene that obviously doesn't appear in the book, but it's a cool little promo. And apparently I did read that this series was heavily reprinted by DC. Like, for example, I have these issues reprinted in a little digest-sized book, right? There's like a version with a record or an audio tape or something. So this was something that they were able to market like in a lot of different ways, which is smart. So anyway,
can I tell you something about your digest version?
Sure.
That was actually a collector's item from cereal boxes.
Really?
Yep. So there was a Batman breakfast cereal, and in 1989, to coincide with the release of the Tim Burton Batman film, that was released in those short stack issues. And the same year, they released it as an audiobook, like you said. It was called an MPI audio edition, where it was reissued with the cassette that you could listen along. And there are certain very famous video streaming sites where you can definitely check out a panel-for-panel recreation with the original audio. It is a product of its time, but it's very interesting to follow along with.
Wow. Interesting. And, it's also interesting that they didn't pick Frank Miller's Batman Year One to do the promotion with. They chose this. I'm going to assume it's because, let's see, this Year One contains scenes of Catwoman being a prostitute. It contains scenes of one character, I think, being left out in the freezing snow with his pants pulled down. We won't get into detail, but this story is clearly more for general audiences, right? We'll agree on that.
Definitely.
Yeah. So anyway, so this story opens up in the Batcave, the classic pre-crisis Batcave. Batman opens up a package, and the package contains the old Batman costume worn by Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's father, which we're familiar with because did you appear on our previous Batman episode? I don't remember.
No, actually, I did not.
Okay, because we reviewed this story where we find out that Thomas Wayne wore a Batman costume to a masquerade ball when he was like younger, and the costume looked like Bob Kane's original design with the bat wings and the weird mask. Except that,
Okay.
and instead of coloring it, because Bob Kane's design was red and brown, and they colored it gray and blue. But I wish they would have kept Bob Kane's colors to make it different enough. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So Batman pulls out this costume, and he's trying to figure out this makes no sense because the costume is here in the Batcave. So how could it be gone? So then he walks over to the display case where the costume is supposed to be, and it says, "This is only the beginning, Batman. Before I'm done, I will destroy you." And he's like, who could have done this? I don't understand. And so basically that's the mystery of the story. And so now he's got to figure out what's going on. And so this is basically just a framework for Batman to flashback to his origin, and basically go through some of the stories that we've already talked about on the show. So we see the story where Thomas Wayne is dressed up in a version of the Batman costume, and then he's forced by a gangster named Lou Moxon to help him, and then he decides to kind of double cross him and punch him out. And then we find out that then when that guy gets out of jail, he hires someone to kill Thomas Wayne, which is a detail that was added in the 1950s, but was kind of used by Jeff Loeb in I didn't read the story, but it might have been The Last Halloween or one of those, which was then used in Matt Reeves' The Batman movie. Like this little subplot was kind of used in those versions. Then we see the famous scene of the Waynes getting killed, but the details I think are closer to the 50s version that we reviewed before, which is instead of Bruce Wayne being kind of helpless and distraught, he's more angry at Joe Chill, and he scares Joe Chill. So Joe Chill leaves. And also, I just want to reiterate about the gun. So the gun shoots Thomas. Yeah, and then the second bullet kills Martha. So maybe this is where that detail starts. I'm not sure, but that's a slight little variation there. And then we should also point out that in pre-crisis continuity, Alfred was not around when Bruce Wayne's parents were killed, which is an interesting detail because after Crisis, certainly Alfred was always part of the story, right? In all the adaptations of Batman. So in this version, he's with his Uncle Philip, and then he meets his housekeeper, Mrs. Chilton, who I've never seen in any other story besides this, but maybe she was in other stories. I don't know. And then we show him, by the graveside swearing vengeance, and then we see him training to be Batman, or not training to be Batman, but just training to be, physically fit. So we see him being raised by Mrs. Chilton, and then again, I pointed out that Len Wein had to incorporate and fit together all the weird, discrepancies in Batman's origin. So clearly, there's an old story where Bruce Wayne wears a Robin costume when he was a kid, but of course this makes no sense because Dick Grayson's costume is supposed to be a circus costume that he wore as one of the Flying Graysons, but maybe that detail was made up later. I don't know. We'll talk about this later. But then, so then we see him, training as a young Bruce Wayne, but wearing this Robin costume, which is a little bit confusing. And then going to college. And having a disagreement with one of his professors where basically his professor is teaching law, and then Bruce Wayne says something like, well, what about this? That's not justice. And he says, no, the professor says, no, it's not justice, it's the law. And so that's kind of the moment where Bruce Wayne decides, well, you know what? I originally wanted to be a cop or a lawyer, but I obviously can't go that route. So I'm going to have to become something else. So we have the famous scene of him sitting in his study, and he's like, well, what am I going to do? I've got to become a symbol. And then just at that moment, the bat flies through the window, and he's like, "A bat! That's it! Like an omen, I shall become a bat." And then we have John Byrne's recreation of the famous shot that Bob Kane drew of Batman kind of crouching over on a ledge, making his first appearance. But we should say at this point in DC Comics, when they drew the original first appearance of Batman, they drew the classic Adam West Batman costume with variation. Like that's the classic. There's no purple gloves. There's no weird shaped mask. That later artists would be more accurate when they redrew this depiction here. But at this point, they kind of just revised things, to make them fit with current storylines. So then we see, kind of like Batman and Robin fighting crime and over the years. And then we get back to some weird details about this story, this detail that was added later, where we find out that Joe Chill got out of jail, and then Batman recognizes his picture, so then he confronts him, takes off his mask, shows him that he's Bruce Wayne. Then Joe Chill goes back to his cronies and is like, "Oh my gosh, I just realized I killed the guy who ended up becoming the Batman. I killed his parents." And they're like, "You created Batman," and so then they all shoot Thomas Wayne, and they're like, "Oh no, we forgot to ask him who Batman is." It's kind of a silly story, but whatever. At least it's accurate to the flashbacks, to the story that it's, flashing back to.
Of course.
So then, so then back in the present, Batman's still flashing back, and he's explaining things to Alfred. Then we see the whole thing about him discovering the costume when he's with. Oh, is this the present? No, this is still a flashback. It gets confusing. But basically, yeah. So then he's finding the old costume again, and he's looking at it. And he's talking to Robin, and then he's in court with Lou Moxon. Oh, this is really stupid. Where Lou Moxon is the guy that hired Joe Chill, but then when he gets out of prison, he's lost his memory. So then Batman tries to shock him into his memory coming back by dressing up in Thomas Wayne's costume, which makes his memory come back quickly. So then he runs outside and gets run over by a car. And I believe that was in one of the old 50s stories as well, but I don't remember for sure. We cut back to the present, and Batman's still explaining things to Robin. Then he gets in his car, and then he drives away, and he's like basically thinking to himself, that he's going to have to, keep investigating this crime. And then the narration is like eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. The grim Batman's own words of earlier this evening come back to him anew. "I have not shed a single tear in my parents' memory since their funeral," he had said. And then we see a little tear coming out of Batman's eyes. And then the narration says, "And he had been right until now." And that's the end of part 1. And I'll just say that in my memory, I always thought, oh, this is what, this is the Batman origin you should be giving to younger readers, because it's a little bit more appropriate for general audiences. And I appreciate them incorporating all of the discrepancies of Batman's long history. But now that I've reread number 1, and I'm going to say more when we get to the end, some of these stories might have been best left forgotten, but that's my opinion. What did you think of this issue number 1, Adam?
I actually quite liked it.
Okay.
I quite liked it for a number of reasons. We're going to talk about it, but you did mention the art. I know Aparo ended up probably finishing most of the art for this issue, but I think this is more of the John Byrne centered issue, if anything. I really do like his work. I love how expressive his characters are. He was notorious to work with, and he was notorious for leaving projects like in the middle of them. But, when he showed up and actually did his work, I think he was revered for a reason. He was an incredible artist who was able to just be so expressive. Like even that opening panel, I think it's on comics page number 2, where Batman is just taking out the tattered costume that his father had worn. It's just so great. The shock on Alfred's face, the cocked eyebrow of Batman himself, even like the twist of his musculature as he's retching it out of the box. Mm-hmm. Like even the small details, like the glass of water tipping over on Alfred's tray. I love that. Mm-hmm. I think also his use of shadow work. A lot of negative space that allowed the inker to do a lot here, but I think it worked. I love the artwork here. in terms of all the story beats, there's stuff that you didn't even mention. Like before I even say how much I love this like series, because I do,
Hmm.
there's some stupid stuff happening here.
Yeah,
uh,
to say the least. Yeah.
one of the stupidest things, and correct me if you feel I'm wrong, but one element we kind of looked over with Mrs. Chilton is that her name in particular is a little bit of a clue because it turns out she's the mother of Joe Chill,
Oh my gosh,
which
I forgot
is
about
so
that.
like convoluted. It's like, what are the chances that this woman happens to take over care for this child whose parents were murdered by her son? It that's just a dumb detail that really serves
Yeah.
no purpose. I
No.
think it's just Wayne just kind of referencing as many stories as possible. But I do like the idea of even Batman as a young boy adopting the Robin costume. I do agree with you. To me, I've always associated the costume with Robin honoring his parents and his time with the Flying Graysons. And yet, I do like the idea of Batman, even, well, I should just say Bruce Wayne looking at himself in the mirror going, this costume's a bit too colorful and garish for me, but it will conceal my identity. And it kind of gives like credence or an origin
Hmm.
to the idea of this costume, which by 1980 standards was garish and ridiculous, but iconic for a reason.
Hmm.
I like the idea of him being this really unknowing kid going out there trying to really start solving crimes, fighting criminals, but not really knowing what to do. And he gets a mentor. And this is something that we never really see with Batman that often. He ends up having this detective as his mentor
Hmm.
who puts him under his wing. His name is Harvey Harris, who is an older DC Comics character. And through that, even though I do like the idea of Bruce Wayne being so dedicated to his cause, he just kind of naturally learns on his own how to become this great detective. I do like the idea of him having this mentor figure that looks over him, which creates a great parallel for his relationship with Robin.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Good
even
point.
the origin of him deciding to become a vigilante. I think far too often in the Batman origin stories, we do not see the reason for him deciding I'm not going to become a lawyer or I'm not going to become
Sure.
a police officer. It's just kind of brushed away. Maybe in more contemporary adaptations, we get
Hmm.
explanations why. But this lays it on. There's a philosophical, psychological issue where Bruce Wayne just figures, I cannot do things legally. I have to do something else. And that kind of use of psychology is what really endeared me to the book. It's silly. Trying to tie together all these plot points, which are very convoluted, is ridiculous. But you do get a sense of Batman's drive and his character. And also, as dark as the story can be, he's not as dark and brooding as we get for contemporary Batman books. He's not this scowling figure, always in the
Hmm.
shadows, speaking gruffly. He has a little bit of humor. He has quite a bit of empathy and humanity. But at the same time, he has this darkness lingering about him, and he's constantly combating that. I like that
Right.
about the series and this particular issue.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that actually reminds me of another detail that was used in. So, okay, there was a Secret Origins series in the late 80s that recreated Golden Age versions of the Origins, but kind of modernized them a little bit. So,
Hmm.
what they would do is they would redo the Golden Age Superman's origin, but just make it a little bit more cohesive, kind of like this. And one of the details they added, or maybe it wasn't added, but it was emphasized, was that Bruce Wayne studied acting, which
Hmm.
makes perfect sense, right? Like he's literally like Bruce Wayne is the persona, the playboy, like the spoiled playboy, and so it makes perfect sense that he would have to study and train to do that, and it just makes me wonder why they've never addressed that again, or even this little scene that you mentioned about the kind of arguing or debating with the professor. Like that's a good idea. So it kind of makes me think that I wish that more current writers would, instead of ignoring stories from the past, they would at least try to emphasize the things that do work. And I think one of the things about this book that the mistakes it makes is it tries to use everything, whereas some of the details they could have adapted, but to make Robin's costume exactly like Dick Grayson's Robin costume, like little things like that, they could have just tweaked it a little bit to make it a little bit more believable. The Joe Chill mother thing is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
That was best left forgotten. But again, I at least appreciate that Len Wein tried to incorporate everything, which is, excuse me, something that current writers absolutely do not do. So this is from a different time, when this is the way things were done. But we've still got 2 more issues to go. So, Adam, would you like to tell everybody what happens in number 2 of the Untold Legend of Batman?
Absolutely. So in this issue, we go from Batman's origins to the origins of his relationships with both his allies and his enemies. The scene opens up where he goes into a dive bar where he is seeking out information from a snitch, literally called Snitch. They don't hand out awards for names in the DC universe, obviously. But with that said, Batman is getting ferocious. He is attacking Snitch with such ferocity that he actually is getting to the point where it looks like he's going to break his jaw, and he's only held off from really doing more damage to Snitch, along with the other patrons of the bar, by the sudden presence of Robin, who tells him, "What are you doing? Haven't you done enough here?" Batman has this great sequence in this one purple panel. I always love me a purple panel. It's on comics page 4 where he drops Snitch and goes, "Yes, of course. There's nothing more this punk can tell me." And you get this sense of Batman really just having lost control, and you see the spiral that his character is going through out of desperation. So Robin accompanies Batman in the Batmobile, and they make their way as he continues to follow up on leads to determine who could have been the culprit that damaged his father's costume. And during this time, we have a flashback where, via internal monologue, Dick Grayson is recounting his own origins about the death of his parents, who were trapeze artists who plummeted to their deaths as part of basically an extortion racket by these mobsters who were forcing the circus owner to pay them in order to protect his business. When he refused to, well, then the Graysons met their demise. Dick overhears this, and he's so incensed he's about to call the police when he's stopped with Batman. Batman appears behind him and tells him not to go to the police and ask him to go into his vehicle. Now, not to follow a cliche, but of course, a young boy being asked by a masked man to accompany him in his vehicle is a little bit of a dated thing, but, we won't touch that. Anyways, Batman does take Dick Grayson back to the Batcave and explains the reason why he shouldn't approach the police, that basically there is this criminal dynasty, this criminal presence around the city, which if he confessed or said anything, dirty cops would basically eliminate Dick Grayson because they know that he would be divulging information that could actually point the finger at this criminal organization. So Batman's doing this to save him. And as Dick Grayson himself talks about all these comparisons, these relations that he has with Batman, because much like him, his parents have passed away. He's seeking vengeance. Ultimately, Bruce Wayne / Batman decides, yes, I want to help you in your quest. And the best way to do that is to adopt you. So it becomes Grayson's legal guardian. Cue sequences of Robin being trained through physical exercise, through mental exercise. He is given the Robin outfit, and he's very eager and proud to wear it. I kind of like this because in a way it's like Bruce handing on the mantle of his original costume persona to Dick Grayson. I do prefer the idea of this being an homage to his parents through the costume of Robin, but I digress. Either way, I think it still works. Then we have a little bit of a callback of their successes as they team up to fight crime, and also including the kind of duality that happens with Bruce Wayne's character. Dick Grayson is utterly embarrassed to go to these big social functions with Bruce Wayne because he becomes very swarmy, he becomes a different persona, and all these women just treat him like this cute little toy. And it's a thing where he wonders, well, how am I surviving this? How can I live with this man who's such a great detective and be such a flamboyant person in this other world? So you get to see this dichotomy between Bruce Wayne and Batman, which is cool. There's further troubles for Dick Grayson, including difficulties in high school, where essentially he's bullied and he can't fight back because he's too well skilled at fighting, to the extent where he would actually really hurt his bullies. Well, time goes on, and inevitably, Robin moves out from Wayne Manor to go on his own, even though he continues on with the mantle of Robin. Uh, as we go to the main story, they return to the Batcave where they are met with Alfred. Now, Alfred discloses something that wasn't really revealed in the previous issue, that Bruce Wayne slash Batman had recently encountered an adventure where he experienced an explosion in a warehouse. And ever since
Hmm.
then, he hasn't quite been acting right.
Right.
He even says something to the extent where I almost feel like during this adventure, he has been confronted with his own mortality, which I thought was an interesting take on that and a possible trigger for what we're about to see to happen.
Mm.
Anyway, we get a brief flashback of Alfred and his origin, and my God, Mr. Pennyworth has such a long and very
Hmm.
prosperous life that he's led. He was a World War II veteran, he was a stage actor whose father actually was the butler for Thomas Wayne.
Right.
And upon his father's death, Alfred's father's death, I should say, his father asked him to continue his legacy. So Alfred gives up the stage and goes to America, where he becomes Bruce Wayne's butler. So this is just him meeting Bruce Wayne for the first time.
And Dick
Um,
Grayson, right?
and Dick Grayson,
So
Robin's already there,
right, he comes in late. Yeah.
very late. Anyway, altercations happen, and eventually Alfred comes to see that Batman and Bruce Wayne are one and the same. He has to help Bruce Wayne become healed after some sort of adventure, and then he does, and he continues aiding Batman and Robin in their battles there on in. We cut back to a sequence in real time where Batman is going over the origins of his rogues gallery, including a relatively detailed origin of the Joker, which I
Right.
was a bit surprised about because really the Joker's origin, even though there's been iterations of it, hadn't really been touched upon too much. I think this might be the first real attempt at a definitive origin of the villain at this point.
Well, the Red Hood story is from the 50s. So I think it was done at least once back then. But maybe it was the first time since the 50s that we saw this version.
It's quite possible. I'd have
Mm.
to do a little bit more research. Some other villains are also introduced. The story of Harvey Dent slash Two-Face, of course, is reiterated, a very infamous, tragic story for this Batman villain. And he just goes through this series of crises going through this rogues gallery, just
Hmm.
thinking he either was responsible for creating his rogues or his rogues have so much knowledge about his true identity that it could be any of them. Any of them have motivation to seek him out to
Right.
discover where the Batcave is and damage his father's costume. Well, anyway, Robin is about to go on his own. He's going to hop into the Batmobile and he's going to do some investigation on his own when suddenly he hears a beep, beep, beep. Well, there's a bomb. So he leaps out, the Batmobile explodes, and despite the rubble and metal everywhere, all three, Robin, Alfred, and Batman together are fine, and there is a single note saying, one by one, I will destroy
Hmm.
the things that make you what you are, and then I will destroy you. And you know it's serious because it's underlined with a double exclamation mark.
Right, right.
Well, Batman scowls, crumples the page, and says, it's a war, only one of us will survive. And then to be continued.
So yeah, first let's talk about the art. Now I'm not a huge fan of John Byrne, but I do think that the storytelling in the first issue was definitely fine. However, I think Jim Aparo is one of the best storytellers in DC and Marvel history. I think this issue is excellent. I can't say enough about his art. His tilted panels, the way the camera flips back and forth between superior, inferior angles, close-ups, wide shots. Um, when you jump to, for example, I'll try to find a good one. Like I was just looking at it, like even page 7, we see the classic Batmobile coming towards us. Then we cut to an interior shot of Batman and Dick Grayson. Then the car's going down. Then we see a shadowy Dick Grayson in the foreground with Batman's lit in front of him. Just little things like that. The variety, but it's not just a variety for variety's sake. It's telling the story as well. I can't say enough about this art. What did you think of Jim Aparo's art in this issue?
I think I agree with you. While I do have a certain love in my heart for Burns' work, There is a certain level of storytelling with the sequentialness of this art that I do think excels over the previous issue. I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of callbacks within panels on various pages as well. You probably remember I mentioned the one panel where Batman is looking down, letting go of the snitch, uh, and he's backdropped by this purple color just behind him on page 4. Well, you go forward to page 5 of the comic, and at the bottom panel, you have an inverse of this where in blue light with a black background, Dick Grayson is peering down in a very similar fashion to how Batman was, but this is after the loss of his parents through this accident where he
Mm,
says, I felt so terribly, terribly alone. And you get this kind of continued sense of desperation with Dick
hmm.
Grayson, maybe marrying to some extent what Batman is feeling in terms of his own desperation. So there's a lot of evocations, just not on the same page, but between panels, between various pages that I agree with you. There's just something about the storytelling that's told through the way these panels are sequenced and through the angles a lot of these, for lack of a better term, shots are depicted from.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a dynamicism that's happening here that even though I would say between the both artists, I do prefer John Byrne's work. I do think this lends itself to better storytelling.
Right. And I have to mention one more page because I just have to give credit where credit's due. It's page 14. Alfred is cleaning the Batcave, and then we cut to him in bed, and then we cut to him hearing a noise, and the camera's behind him as he goes down the stairs, and he's in shadow, but the floor is all lit up. Then the
Mm-hmm.
next panel, it's reversed where he is coming through the a doorway and the panel is black and he like there's a little like a frame of white, right? Just things
Mm-hmm.
like that are so smart. And then cutting to the next shot of the big reveal of Batman and Robin. If you just sit back and look at the page, it just makes the page design so nice. Versus, and I'll defend modern comics till I'm blue in the face, but there are a lot of modern comics that like to repeat the same panel over and over again, or just have the same kind of framing or distance from the object, from the subject over and over again. And I don't think that's the way to go. I think this is a much more it tells the story better, and it's also just more visually appealing. So yeah, I absolutely love the art in this one. Now let's talk about the story. I'm gonna say I appreciate, like, if you want to get a summary of Batman's origin pre-crisis, this book is invaluable. But
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the things he chose to include or not include are strange. Like, okay, so we get Joker's origin and we get Two-Face's origin, but nobody else's. Like, why didn't he choose Catwoman and Riddler and whoever else? Why just those two? It just seems a little bit lopsided. What did you think, Adam?
To me, that did make sense, only because we have two allies whose origins are being told, and we have two villains. Now, granted, there's a disparity between the length that's afforded the villains and the allies here.
Hmm.
Obviously, Robin gets the most attention, as he rightfully should. But yeah, it does seem a little bit disparate. I think both Joker and Two-Face get 2 to 3 pages apiece for their origin story. And even though I think, especially by 1980, you could identify these two as being the most important villains in
Mm,
Batman's entire rogues gallery, with maybe the exception of Catwoman for various reasons.
mm,
It is a thing where I don't have an issue with just these two. Also, for the sake of brevity, they had to cut something. I mean, they couldn't
sure.
tell all these different villains' origins. Uh, my issue, I guess, with this storytelling in this particular issue is more the method of which it was told, where it's a product of its time. I like Len Wein. Don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of his work. I love, he helped helm Swamp Thing. So, he's always going to have
Hmm.
a place in my heart. But he does have a tendency to write in that way where characters are narrating what they're doing, which it's a product of its time. And
Hmm.
I don't feel like it took me out of the story that often, but there were moments where it just felt like, I know you're walking. You don't have to describe what's going on. The dialogue between characters was fine. There was just a few moments of
Hmm.
that I felt took me out a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a group of writers, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Jerry
Hmm.
Conway, those three, you could say maybe Roy Thomas isn't there, but Roy Thomas started earlier. But especially those three, they wrote 90% of the comics in the 70s and 80s. Every third comic was written by one of those two. Maybe if you added Bill Mantlo to the list, you'd cover everything. But the reason I mentioned those two is because, or those three, is because all three of them were editor-in-chief of Marvel at one point, if not successively. I think Len Wein and Marv Wolfman were roommates, maybe, or anyway, they were all friends. And then there's other groups too. Like if you look at the bullpen, like Jim Starlin was friends with this guy, Howard Chaykin was friends with Larry Hama. So yeah, there's little groups here, but I associate Len Wein and Marv Wolfman and Jerry Conway as this triumvirate. Is that the word? Triumvirate of people that kind of, they were everywhere at Marvel and DC, because if you look at Batman, Jerry Conway wrote Batman, Len Wein wrote Batman, and Marv Wolfman wrote Batman, all in the 80s, right? And then in the 70s. So these were the biggest guys at DC at this point. So it's very appropriate that Len Wein would do this. So it's almost like you can't really judge this as a Len Wein comic as much as it's a DC comic. Like this is the way all DC comics were, and most Marvel comics were written this way in this style. So it is very dated, but everything, like I said, fits together. The writing fits with the art, with the color. The Batmobile design is very 80s, but it fits, right? Batman's costume fits. Everything fits, I think.
Oh yeah, I want to say I love the Batmobile design, that classic vintage look that called back to the 50s, but was augmented with a lot of those 70s elements.
Yes.
It's my favorite Batmobile. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Because I was shocked a little bit by the amount of detail given to Alfred's origin and his backstory. What did you take from the depiction of Alfred's life from this comic? Did you enjoy it, or did you think it was a little bit too much?
Well, I personally don't like the way that as the years go by, they add more and more to his backstory where, you know, he was a tough guy. He was special black ops in World War whatever. I do like that he has some history. Like it says here that he was in World War II. Mm-hmm. And he has some combat experience, which I guess makes sense. But I personally prefer the Michael Gough version or whatever from the Tim Burton's film. Like that old style, gentlemanly British butler versus the more street smart Michael Caine, or the even more tough guy. Who's the one from The Batman? The actor, Andy Serkis.
Yes.
That's not my Alfred. Like I want Alfred to be a proper, dry, sarcastic gentleman, right? That's the Alfred I like. So the backstory was fine, but I think the less about his backstory, the better for me. What do you think?
I'm a little bit on the fence because on one hand, there's two things I want to say. One, I do like having more characterization for Alfred, and it's not that he's this like extremely tough soldier. He just admitted that he was in World War II. He fought. He had the sense of justice where he was fighting for freedom, which, you know, coalesces with the, you know, the strategies that Batman is trying to employ for his crime fighting. You know, he's doing this to try to protect people, to try to ensure freedom for citizens. With that said, though, I mean, I guess it's because of the generation of Batman I grew up with. I always grew up with the notion of Alfred being the paternal figure to Batman, being the surrogate father that he never really was able to have. And, you know, you talked about your preferred Alfred. I think mine would be Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who did the voice of Alfred from Batman the Animated Series.
Yes.
To me, that's the best. Like you said, slightly sarcastic. He has this kind of great repartee with Bruce Wayne and Batman. And at the same time, you can tell Batman has a love for him. He is this paternal figure that the closest thing he's ever had to a father, really. To me, that's great. This origin story, because of that element being removed, it's such an important part for me that's missing from their dynamic. I didn't care for that.
Yeah. And again, I think if you read the original paper issues, there's actually a lot of explanation at the back about how they incorporated each, you know, issue or story into this cohesive story. And I wish I could have read that. I might even have them somewhere, but I can't find them. But yeah, there's definitely things they could have left out, but I appreciate them trying to make everything fit. Like apparently this scene where Alfred first sees Bruce Wayne and Batman together, that was in there to explain a discrepancy, because I think there might have been one story where he came in at this point in the career and another story where he came in at a different point. So I think they were trying to make things a little bit cohesive, but I don't remember exactly. Yeah. So there's little things like that. But anyway, yeah, I mean, again, as a historical document, I can't say anything bad about this. I love it. But we still got one more issue to go, folks. So now we're going to talk about Untold Legend of Batman #3. Also written by Len Wein, also drawn by Jim Aparo. And we're going to tag team on this one, but I'll start it off, the first couple scenes here. So we open up with this cover here that's actually used for the reprint collection here. It's a classic shot by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who drew all the covers. A Batman kind of lunging forward in the sky, coming off of like a fire exit on a building. Nice solid red background. I really like this cover. So we open up with Batman and Alfred in the Batcave, and we see the ruins of the exploded Batmobile in the background. And he's, Batman's talking about the note and what it means and, how he's going to figure this out. Now, we then cut to a scene that reveals something I completely wiped from my mind. Because, again, we're used to the post-crisis Batman origin and also developed by the cartoon, developed by the movies where, did Lucius Fox design the Batmobile? Was it Bruce Wayne because Bruce Wayne's so smart? No, it's just some stunt driver named Jack. What's his name? Jack.
Oh, you'll love this. Jack Edison.
I mean, again, do we have to incorporate every story? Sure, let's do that. I mean, again, if you want to find out Batman's pre-crisis origin, this is it. They tell you everything. So in this version, a stunt driver named Jack Edison designed the Batmobile. He's on a phone call with Robin. I hope this phone call is not being, bugged by anyone, right? Because they're freely talking about Batman and the Batmobile and blah, blah, blah. It's just a little weird artifact of history that's where the Batmobile comes from. But then we cut to a scene of now Bruce Wayne is in the streets again, and he's trying to get information, right? And he ends up, who does he roughing up here? You can take over if you remember. Who is this guy here?
Well, I don't really know who this guy is. I'm going to call him long-haired thug number 362.
Okay,
but,
sure.
What happens is the long-haired thug is actually beating up our friendly Irish stereotype Shamrock, who is a snitch that Batman is trying to get some information from. He manages to beat up and basically scare away the long-haired thug to stop that individual from beating up Shamrock. He has a conversation with him, and Shamrock just reveals he has no information to go on. Batman then consults some other snitches that he relies upon, such memorable characters as Slugger, Poet, and Queen Bess. I'm not sure if you know these characters. I think they eluded the Nolan adaptations.
They were somehow left out. Yeah.
I can't believe Criminal. But then we get to what I think is very crucial. The last missing piece of the iconic Batman character archetypes, which would be Commissioner Gordon. Finally, we get an exchange between Commissioner Gordon and Batman. Batman is, of course, talking to the commissioner about this quest he's on, about how someone is basically putting him under attack. They know where he lives, they know his identity, and he's trying to figure out who this could be. And Gordon has the best line to share with him, which is, subconsciously, you don't want to find any clues because the person behind all this is somebody close to you, someone you care about. What a great line, and what a great reaction from Batman, who looks like he just got slapped really hard in the nethers because of the shock on his face.
Right.
It's great. And then from here, Batman, of course, does what Batman always does with Jim Gordon. He flies through the window while Gordon is unawares. But then we get the origin of his relationship with James Gordon. And I don't know if you want to take this part over to talk a little bit about this.
Sure. So we cut over to of course, I don't remember, even though I just read this yesterday, I barely remember, but I'll do my best. But basically, Jim Gordon we cut over. Oh, we. So he came in, unlike the Nolan film where he came in right at the beginning of the murder of Bruce Wayne. He comes into Batman's career after it's already started. We see him coming across criminals that have been kind of bound up with little notes on them. These are the punks who robbed the First Federal Bank. They're all yours with a little bat symbol on it, right? And we see that the cops are trying to, arrest the Batman. They're shooting at the Batman. And basically, Jim Gordon's kind of on the fence, and he's like, I wouldn't worry too much about that if I were you, Collins. I have the uncomfortable feeling that we'll be hearing from the character again. So he's kind of, even though he's a cop, he's sort of sees the good that comes out of Batman. And then we see like shots of, like, again, one of the classic Batmobiles driving by, and the Joker's body, well, not body, but the Joker being thrown out the window. And we see other flashbacks to other, cases. But then finally one day, he's finally confronted with Batman face to face, where Batman comes into Jim Gordon's office. And there's a very cool scene where Jim Gordon pulls a gun on him, and Batman's standing there, and he just stands there and he says, "For your sake as well as mine, put the gun away." And he basically says, "We're on the same side, my friend, and if you don't believe me, then you'd better pull that trigger." And then we see a nice wordless 3-panel sequence where Jim Gordon's holding the gun, and then his arm relaxes, and then they shake hands. And it's a nice little scene. I like that. And then we have a beautiful silhouette scene where he puts the gun away and he's talking to Batman, and then he looks, and then Batman's disappeared, right? And again, that's the classic Batman disappearing without any noise scene. Then he looks down and he's looking at the picture of his daughter, Barbara Gordon, which I actually, at this point in the story, I actually forgot she existed. So I'm glad that they brought her in, because I found out a detail. When Frank Miller was writing Batman Year One, he forgot about Barbara Gordon completely. So he had to shove her in like one line saying, "Oh yeah, my niece," because it's supposed to be his daughter. But since Frank Miller forgot about her, he's like, I'll just make Barbara Gordon her niece, or his niece. So yeah, I think they fixed that later. But anyway, so then we have a little shot of Barbara Gordon eavesdropping on Batman, talking to Jim Gordon, Barbara Gordon training, graduating, putting on the Batgirl costume at a masquerade party, and then coincidentally having to fight crime that night, and then eventually, becoming Batgirl.
I just want to bring up that I love this callback, because this is actually a reference to, I believe, the first comic that Barbara Gordon as a Batgirl was ever featured in, where she actually did have to retrieve Bruce Wayne, who was being kidnapped by these masked bandits, which is kind of a cool throwback. I really like that.
Sure, yeah. And if you want to take over for the next few pages, feel free.
Sure. Then, after his reminiscing, Robin enters to Commissioner Gordon's office. They begin discussing, again, the fact that Bruce Wayne, or, well, not Bruce Wayne, Batman, has been acting a little bit different than normal, and that Robin is concerned about how desperate Batman is seeming. We then cut to Batman entering. I keep flip-flopping between the two. There's a reason why, for my confusion. You'll see in just a few moments. But Bruce Wayne enters into the Wayne Foundation Tower. Again, he's very snippy, very short with people. He enters through the office, having a very terse word with his secretary. And this draws the attention of Lucius Fox, who you actually brought up a little bit earlier.
Right.
Now, they have a brief exchange where Lucius basically says, "You look like you need a friend right now, and I can be that for you if you let me." So at the end, there's a brief recounting of how Lucius Fox entered into this position for the Wayne Foundation. And inevitably, Bruce Wayne goes, "You're right. I think I'm acting a bit intense right now. I apologize." So Lucius Fox makes his way out. It's just a little 2-page thing to reference his character, but I think it's a nice little character detail to basically ground the idea that Bruce Wayne still has social connections outside of his identity as Batman. But then, peering at his own reflection in the glass, he has a revelation. Because as Mike mentioned earlier, at this point in the continuity, the Batcave is actually underneath Wayne Tower. It's not actually at the Wayne Manor. He goes back to Wayne Manor to go to the original Batcave because he believes he might actually be able to find the culprit there. Well, he enters and he has these flashbacks, including one where he sees himself as a young child talking to his father. And he confesses to his father how he wants to grow up to be a doctor so he can help people. I actually really enjoy this scene. It's a little bit saccharine, but the vision of Thomas Wayne says, that's what life is about, Bruce. Helping people. Our love, our compassion are the only things that set us apart from the beasts of the field. Promise me you'll never forget that, Bruce. So keep that in mind for all future stories where fanboys want to see Batman break people's necks. That, to me, is Batman.
Right. I agree.
Anyway, there's some more ghosts of the past that haunt Batman. And inevitably, this leads him during this journey to enter into this alcove. I believe the same one where an origin story from the last issue where Alfred first spotted Batman and Robin down the stairway in this hidden entrance through a clock. He goes down that same entryway, but it's a trap. The walls start closing in on him. It's a little bit ambiguous because of all these visions he's seeing, if this is part of a weird sort of reaction he's having or if it's really occurring. But nope, sure enough, the walls are closing in on him. And then he hears a voice revealing who the culprit was. And it turns out the person behind this all was Bruce Wayne. Mike, why don't you take this over for a little bit?
Yeah. I don't know what to say about this part because I didn't like it, but basically we see Batman confronting. Sorry, is this himself or is this supposed to be Thomas Wayne?
So from what I'm seeing here, this is Bruce Wayne. It's himself because
dressed in Thomas Wayne's costume, right?
Well, actually, what this is just before you get to that, because that is also something to talk about. So he basically sees a vision of himself. Batman sees a vision of Bruce Wayne, where Wayne says because of Batman, he's lost friends. He's lost loved ones. He may have lost his very sanity. And everything that was happening was actually this sort of subconscious drive. Remember how James Gordon said earlier, maybe it's something subconscious where you don't want to see where the clues are leading. Well, it's actually the subconscious element, the Bruce Wayne in his mind, that's trying to kill Batman for getting basically rid of Bruce Wayne and ruining Bruce Wayne's life.
Right.
So I guess Bruce Wayne tore up his own dad's costume, planted a bomb in the Batmobile, and somehow engineered the walls of the original Batcave to start closing in on themselves, like the trash compactor from Star Wars. I'm going to comment on that a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. But then what happened?
The part that you were referencing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then Thomas Wayne comes in, dressed in the pre-Batman Batman costume. They're arguing back and forth. They wrestle. They fight. And then Thomas Wayne is unmasked, and it's actually Dick Grayson still wearing the Robin Domino mask. Okay. Now, when the mask comes off, Batman says, "Yes, I think I'm going to be fine now, thanks to you, Robin." And we see this Robin. Now, this is where it gets even worse, in my opinion, because then Robin says, "You knew it was me in the costume?" And Batman says, "Does it matter?" Yeah, it does matter, Len. It's like, okay, so Bruce Wayne, so Batman finds out that he himself did all the stuff, but now he also finds out that Robin was Tom. It's too much. And it's one thing to have a shocking twist, but when you then reveal that the other character knew about it, it's even worse. And then the fact that he doesn't decide if he knew or not is lazy writing, in my opinion, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Mm-hmm. So
I just want to bring up one thing though, Mike, just before to wrap this up. When Robin is dressed up as Thomas Wayne, he says, and I quote, during the explosion of the warehouse, somehow it's affected your mind, creating a temporary schizophrenia with paranoid delusion.
Right.
And then later Robin says, well, I thought if I dressed up like this, the shock of it would snap you out of it. And then Batman basically says, you're right, it worked. I'm sane now. What the hell is that?
I know. It's very simplistic. And again, of its time, I can forgive it, but it's after 3 issues of mystery, I really think this climax is anticlimactic. Mm-hmm. And it's such a cliche of a twist that, did you ever see the film Adaptation with Nicolas Cage? It's a great movie. And in the movie, Nicolas Cage plays twins. One is an aspiring artist slash screenwriter, and the other one is an aspiring commercial screenwriter, and they're kind of always debating and arguing throughout the film. But at one point, the Hollywood screenwriter comes to the artist and says, "I got this great idea for a screenplay. It's about a guy who's a serial killer, and there's a cop that's investigating him." And then before he can get to the climax, the twist, the artist Nicolas Cage says, "Let me guess. The cop is the serial killer." And he's like, "Oh, how did you guess that?" Because this twist has been done so many times that it's not even funny. The fact that Batman was investigating who the culprit was and ends up being himself. I mean, you could argue it goes back to Oedipus Rex, but the way that Oedipus Rex figured it out was much better than this. So I'm not happy with this climax. The rest of the issue is just as good as the first two. I'm not going to criticize that, but I guess overall, as a historical document of Batman's origin, this is a great series. It's indispensable reading. But again, like we said earlier, the mystery is just a framework to hang all these flashbacks on. But the framework itself, I don't think is very strong. What do you think?
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, here's the thing, like the mystery leading up to it is juicy. It's tangible. There's someone that actually knows Bruce Wayne and Batman are the same person. They have some stake in destroying their life. And yet it ends with being some sort of delusion. It's horrible. I mean, at the very least, you have characters like Hugo Strange or Scarecrow, where you could say it was maybe a manifestation of some sort of like hallucinogenic drug that he was administered. Something like that. Something more than just, oh, he was in an explosion and he got a little weird, but he's better now. Like that is like bad writing 101. And I also feel that somewhere along the lines, maybe he copped out a little bit, because there was a lot of setup about Mrs. Chilton and this whole notion about how she took care of Bruce Wayne, and then how, of course, her son Joe Chill was actually the murderer of his parents, and then he ended up dying. Like, right. I really thought, is this some sort of weird thing where it'll actually be Mrs. Chilton or like some sort of revenge plot, which would be ridiculous, but at the same time would kind of make sense in a way.
Right.
And yeah, again, you could have thrown in any number of villains. Ra's al Ghul, you could have had Scarecrow, anyone that would have fit the bill a little bit more. Even like a manifestation of Bruce Wayne doing this wouldn't be horrible if they played the cards right. It was resolved way too easily. By the end of this, I think it negated the strength of the framing narrative from the previous two issues, to the point where I wish it was just a series of vignettes just basically saying, here's the origin of Robin, here's the origin of Batman, this is why Batman and Commissioner Gordon hang out, this is why the Joker is. I would have preferred that.
That's a great point. I don't know. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think what it is it goes back to my theory that I'm going to copyright, that the the Golden Age and Silver Age writers were professional writers writing for children, and the 70s and 80s writers were amateur writers writing for adults. And now I don't want to crap on Len Wein, but him and the guys I mentioned, like Jerry Conway, I love Jerry Conway's writing, but when he started writing Spider-Man, he was 19 years old. You can't expect a 19-year-old to have as much skill or experience as even someone like Stan Lee, who was 40 when he created the Fantastic Four, right? So Len Wein grew up reading comics and loving comics, and a lot of people like his stories, but I don't think that he could have had a career as a novelist or a screenwriter. I just don't think so. And it's like the stories that he's referencing are hokey and they're silly, but then he's trying to make them into a slightly more adult, cohesive whole. But the story that he uses to do that is not good. It's weak. And like you said, it would have been better to just have either just redo the stories or just have Bruce Wayne sitting there reminiscing or something. But to build up a mystery and then have it amount to this was a big disappointment, I think.
There's also that underlying tension where Batman is really put to like his wit's end. He's very desperate. He's beating up criminals beyond reason. He is crying for the first time apparently ever since his parents' death.
Right.
And it's just that thing where if this is driving him so much to the edge, what a horrible payoff. Like this is bleeding like over to the territory where it's almost parody. You better have such a great payoff for all of this, and you have nothing. And even that tension, that sort of like blurring of the lines of his morality, where Batman's being more aggressive and more violent than normal, that's not addressed anywhere.
Right, 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 right.
No,
We're told, but we don't see it.
exactly. So with that said, I think this is the weakest of all three issues. I simply think between the atmosphere of the first issue and the very good storytelling of the second one, this one peters out. I like the stuff with Commissioner Gordon, but overall, the ending just really made this plummet in quality. But with that said, Mike, two questions. One,
Sure.
what did you think? And how would you compare this to Batman Year One?
Oh, well, Batman Year One is one of my favorite Batman stories. I actually think Frank Miller's work on Year One and Daredevil Born Again are his best. That's the peak Frank Miller for me. So I mean, other than making Catwoman a prostitute and a few other things I didn't agree with, I think Batman Year One is essential reading, and it's actually what I would tell definitely an adult reader. I would point them to Batman Year One as a place to start. So I'm not sure what you think of Year One, but I love it.
Hmm. So I'm going to say between the two, you definitely recommend Year One over this.
Oh, yes, no question, no question. This is good as an artifact, and I love the art, but not as a story. No.
You see, as a story, yeah, I will agree. Year One is more cohesive, but as a representation of who Batman is, even though we had some poor characterization at the end of the Untold Legend of Batman, I still had a better sense of who Batman was. He was a more rounded character. Year One, I actually do have some criticisms of it. It's a great book, but I don't really get a big sense of who Batman is in a way, because I think that's where Miller was really into showing Batman being more of a mythical figure, the specter in the night, rather than being the persona of this damaged human being, Bruce Wayne. You have elements of that, especially in the first issue of Year One. I'm not going to deny that. And I will agree with you that I think book 1 and 4 of Year One are quintessential reads. The middle two, especially the Catwoman one, I have ambivalence towards, but no, I do agree with you. But I think maybe it's because I'm biased. I grew up with the Burton Batman. I grew up with the animated series Batman. I love that mixture of the dark brooding character with some of the hokey elements from the 60s and the 66 serial. To me, that is a truer, well-rounded Batman. And I think in a way, even though as a piece of literary work and as a piece of artistic work, nowhere near Year One, but as representing who Batman is as a core idea, I actually think this does a better job at that.
Well, yeah, I guess Year One is just Year One. This is his entire career almost, right? So it's definitely more comprehensive. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess it also just depends what you're going for, because the unfortunate thing about Batman Year One is now we can also look at it in the context of Frank Miller's entire career, which now he's done Batman Strikes Again and Dark Knight Strikes Again and Dark Knight Master Race and what's the other one? All-Star Batman, which have completely tainted his earlier work, unfortunately, because you kind of see some of the cracks in the facade when you go back and look at his older work, unfortunately. So that definitely taints it. But I still do think that just as something to read, I'd much rather read Year One all day. But I will say there's one more thing I want to say just about the art. There's some great pages that we've got to talk about on here by Jim Aparo. And my favorite sequence, because I think Jim Gordon might be my favorite supporting character of any superhero. On page 7, that whole scene in Jim Gordon's office is great. I absolutely love it. But I love the second page when we see the close-up of Jim Gordon. Then he turns around and sees the empty, like the window open with the curtains blowing. And then we see Batman swinging away in the distance. The thing about it is the art is so good that I think it's ruined by the dialogue. Because if you look at what, like these 3 panels, we see, well, Batman, what do you think? Have I struck a nerve or gone? In all the years I've known the man, he hasn't changed. So mysterious, so elusive. There are times I'm astonished that I ever got to know him at all. Now, wouldn't this sequence be much better by just almost completely removing the dialogue in the last panel and just having like a huh, and that's it? You know what I mean? Like,
100%.
Yeah, it just shows how overwritten it is, right?
That is going to the point I was talking about, where characters sometimes over-explain what they're doing or what they're thinking. Even just having this as a word balloon rather than a thought bubble or like a caption box.
Yes.
And like you said, make it brief. Don't go on. Don't use this purple prose. We get it. So yeah, I think we can both agree that this series has flaws, that it's a product of its time. But as you said, there's sequences in the art that are just incredible. You referenced page 11, where you just have these images without words, where Jim Gordon just slowly drops his pistol as him and Batman shake hands. That, I think, is everything you need to know about the relationship between Jim Gordon and Batman. That, to me, is pretty much what you said earlier. No words are needed. It speaks for itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as far as you also mentioned some of the references, like to the explosion, right? Mm-hmm. And the way they kind of dropped into the story. Now, I don't know what other stories were published around this time, but it's possible that explosion actually happened in an issue of Batman. But in the first issue of this series, there's a really awkward line from, I think it's Alfred. I'm just going to dig it up quickly. So back in issue 1, Alfred says something like, where is it? Oh, Master Bruce, are you all right? You've been pushing yourself rather hard lately. Your problems with the Catwoman, that warehouse explosion. So I believe somewhere in my reading, I found out that reference to Catwoman was a direct reference to, like, you know, Detective Comics number 517 or whatever. But it doesn't help the story. You don't like it because it dates it. Like, I mean, it doesn't ruin the story or anything, but he didn't need to say that. He just needs to say, you've been pushing yourself hard lately. You don't need the line, the problems with Catwoman. How does that help the story? To reference an issue that we don't have access to, that we can't read, it's just a way of fitting it into the continuity of the day. And the warehouse explosion, you know, that's fine if it actually was a story that happened. But again, it's like, to make this a perfect, cohesive, organic story, they should have had that as a cold open, right? Or something,
Agreed.
right? Yeah. So it's another strike against the story. I think the idea of this book is really cool, but I think the execution is heavily flawed.
I will say, with that said, I like this balance that this Batman has, this balance between being a dark psychological character while being tethered to humanity. And maybe this is my bias, why I actually overall, even though I hate the ending of it, like capital H hate, it's won me over in the end, because I like this Batman. I like the Batman that has the Bat family. I like the Batman who isn't just a dark specter. A lot of people love that, and especially as the movies and adaptations get darker and more brooding, we see more of that. I want a Batman that's fighting for humanity. I want a Batman who's fighting for hope. I want a Batman who is really just a damaged little boy who remembers saying to his father, I want to be like you and help people. So remember empathy and do what you can to help people. That, to me, Batman is a character that is defined by tragedy, but a very strong ethos as well. And to me, I think that's why maybe it's not a great comic series, but I think this is a great Batman. And maybe that's why I ended up liking it so much.
I'm with you on that. I definitely like this Batman more than the Batman of the last 10, 20 years. I'll definitely agree with you on that. And that's why everyone should read more 80s Batman. Which is available in reprints. It's available digitally, so it's definitely out there. Everyone should check it out. I definitely want to thank Adam Antium for joining us for our special Batman Part 2. There is a Batman Part 1 on Slam, so be sure to check it out. And hopefully next week, Joshua Mervell will be with us again. And on next week's episode, we will be reviewing the Tiny Titan, the Atom. So be sure to join us for that. And on the next episode of Taped Crusaders, we'll be doing Scarlet Pimpernel. So if the strike is over, you'll be seeing that soon. If not, you'll have to wait. Sorry about that, folks. But anyway, and until the next time, see you later.